So, it's safe to say I liked Resident Evil 7, but wasn't exactly in love with how it only partially chose to resurrect old school survival horror, and then spent half the game trying to be something else. But then, about a year and some change later, Capcom dropped a teaser for a remake of Resident Evil 2. This was something that people had been asking for since the remake of the original came out, but they just never really considered it or got around to it as worth their time. I mean, the way Resident Evil 0 ended up didn't help things, and a little game called Resident Evil 4 was too busy revolutionizing the entire third-person shooter genre for the next 20 years, so I mean, well, that was until a fan project called Resident Evil 2 Reborn started to make some waves around 2015, when Resident Evil Revelations 2 was still fresh. I remember it, I was there. It wasn't 2002 anymore, so a fixed camera angle remake was not gonna cut it. So Resident Evil 2 Reborn was a modern over-the-shoulder fan remake of Resident Evil 2, in Unreal Engine. And a lot of people were excited for it, myself included. This was made by fans, and while looking at it, of course you can tell this isn't very polished and very indie jank. You can see the passion in it, from what happens when fans look at something with realistic modern eyes, while caring about what they're making. Being developed by Invader Games, who would go on to change their name to Invader Studios and work on the Daymare franchise, which are indie horror games inspired by games like Resident Evil. Absolutely go check them out, they're great, especially the second one. But then, Capcom shut it all down, pissing pretty much everyone off. And, to add insult to injury, they released Resident Evil 7, which, like I said, while praised critically, wasn't exactly everyone's cup of tea. But then the rumor mill started to spin. A Resident Evil 2 remake might be in the works. Not only that, but Capcom had seen the Resident Evil 2 Reborn project's excitement, and didn't just kill off Invader Studios' work with a giant middle finger, but flew them out to meet with them and talk about their ideas, to see how they could help with the remake that they were working on themselves. And then, after cooking that shit up in the kitchen, the official Resident Evil 2 remake was shown off to the world. And the world went crazy. This wasn't just faithful fixed camera recreation with some added improvements like the Resident Evil 1 remake, but a complete modern reimagining, made as if it came out today in the RE engine. An engine which Resident Evil 7 had done a good job of putting over. Some people, typically a little on the senior citizen side, are still a little salty about the fixed camera angles getting the axe. But I mean, they're just fucking wrong. Go lower your cholesterol or some shit, I don't know. Listen, the point is, we lost our fucking minds. It didn't matter if you were an old school Resident Evil fan or a modern Resident Evil fan. They were thinking about you when they made this game, and it shows. So I waited, patiently, January 2019. We got the one-shot demo in the meantime. I think you got like 20 to 30 minutes to complete it and then you couldn't play it again, which was a fucking horrible idea for a demo. And I hope whoever thought of it was called into the corporate office, doused in cold water, and then slapped as hard as humanly possible. And then the day came. I sat there waiting and streamed it. I look back on streaming both the Resident Evil 2 remake and Doom 2016 as peak YouTube hobby nostalgia for me. And did this game live up to the hype? You're damn fucking right. This is your spoiler warning for both Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, both original and remake. Though, since these are remakes, things will be a bit more summarized than usual, especially in the case of Resident Evil 2. Remake 3 is a bit more complicated, but we'll get to that. Oh yeah, and before we start this, there's one thing I need to address. In the last video on Resident Evil 7 and 8, a couple of people were bothered by the fact that I didn't think PT was that good, and that it influenced Resident Evil 7's final design. And thought they were clever because they could use Google and see that Resident Evil 7 started development a few months before PT even came out. Only they're not. Not only could started development mean a million different things, from pre-planning right down to some concept art, but Capcom wasn't even done with Revelations 2 until mid-2015. So started development in 2014 refers to their initial build of the game that was still based on RE6's mechanics. Which, if you do the math and take into account that Capcom said that this version didn't make it too far in development, before they switched up makes sense. Starting development on the actual overhauled Resident Evil 7 sometime around late 2014 to early 2015 would give them plenty of time to change direction, look to their peers in things like PT and Outlast for inspiration, and start building their new engine. And make it to E3 2015 to test the reactions of everyone to an even more bare-bones demo, which at the time they hadn't let anyone in the public know was set up to be the next Resident Evil game, because they weren't sure if they were making the right call yet and hadn't fully committed, which is also why it took another year for an announcement, while they worked on developing the engine further as well as the game. I know you want to show mommy and daddy that you can use Google, but show them you have a little common fucking sense too. Like I didn't already research all of that before I said what I said. Anyway, moving on to the current video at hand. As always, I'm starting with Leon first and Claire second scenarios, because who the hell wouldn't want to play Leon first? Resident Evil 2 Remake starts slightly different from the original, in that Leon stops at a gas station on his way to Raccoon City, and while trying to help injured in there, he's attacked by a zombie, and runs into Claire from there. From there, everything plays out similar enough to the original, with the truck driver being bitten and crashing into the car, separating Leon and Claire. And the second this camera pans around and you get control of Leon, let me tell you, 20 years of gaming evolution rushes straight to your fingertips. The graphics, the sound, the controls. This 200% feels like what if Resident Evil 2 was made today. They fixed the exact problems I had with the original's run to the police station right off the bat. It's shorter, it's much easier to avoid the zombies like you're supposed to, and even if this is your first survival horror style Resident Evil game and you waste your ammo out here without knowing any better yet, you won't really put yourself in a position where you're soft locked, unlike the original. Handgun bullets and a first aid spray are some of the first things handed to you when you make it to the station, and thanks to the game's new mechanics are much more useful here than they would have been in the original. On top of that, there is no way to fuck yourself or get caught off guard in which direction you should go first. The game has you go one way and then the other, and you don't have to deal with any lickers for the time being, which was always a kind of bullshit thing to spring on you before you get a shotgun. Leon takes a look at a nearby laptop and sees an officer who's found a way out, but needs help, and heads to where he is. But he's put in a position where he can't do much to save him, and has to settle for his notebook with the escape plans. He's ambushed and almost killed, but is saved by our boy Marvin, who gives him proper gear, and tells him to look for a way out of here, using the secret passage marked in the notebook. And from there, the game opens up and lets you do that Resident Evil thing we all love so much. With that out of the way, let's talk gameplay. Let's start with the obvious. The shitty fixed camera angles and the tank controls are thrown out of the door for good. They're never coming back, and I can't say I will ever miss them. Now, you move, aim, shoot, and observe, just like you would expect from any game made in the last 20 years. Now, if you're a little on the older side, that sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. And it might be painful to hear, but yes, it's been almost 20 years since Resident Evil 4 and Gears of War locked in what a third-person camera should look like. The benefits of these improvements are numerous. The simple act of being able to see what the fuck you're shooting at and running the way you want to run alleviates all of the frustration that the classic games had. Being able to move and shoot instead of forgetting that your goddamn legs work sounds like it should be a no-brainer, right? It should be, but with Resident Evil it took until 2012 to get a mainline entry to do this. Silent Hill had it in 1999. I also don't have to watch Leon pump my precious handgun ammo into body shots instead of headshots while internally enraged by his incompetence anymore. Headshots are a thing, and they are very important. Now, to help sort of balance out the conveniences and expectations of modern game design, zombies in these remakes take a bit of a beating. And unlike the older games, when they go down, there isn't much of a way to tell whether or not they're just playing dead, since their heads don't turn anymore. You just have to take a chance and either slash at them or shoot them again. The best way to know if one is truly dead is that if they're already down on the floor when you shoot them again, and they die, they'll typically play a death animation. But sometimes even that is a red herring. To encourage you to move around a bit less, your aim reticule gets narrow if you stand still, and a well-placed headshot, while in this state, has a much increased chance of a critical headshot, which does what you would assume it does if you've ever landed one in the remake of the first game. Also, from Remake 1, to deal with the fact that everything hits harder, the defensive items also make a return. There are two types of grenades, frag and flash. They do what you think they do. Frags blow shit up, but flashbangs are a bit interesting in that they stun a group of zombies to let you past, but are much more useful against lickers who are blind, but the bang part of the flashbangs comes into play here. There's also the combat knife, which can be reused, but only if you down whatever you used it on to pick it back up. And it also has a durability meter, so be careful with it. Each defensive item can be used when grabbed, but unlike Remake 1, can also be used offensively too. And they are much stronger damage-wise or radius-wise when they're used offensively. The knife is also completely broken against lickers in this game, allowing you to stun lock them most of the time with it. It was clearly not intentional to allow this, which is why it is no surprise that Resident Evil 3 Remake removes it. Though it is pretty useful in this game because lickers are buffed to shit. Outrunning one that spotted you without taking extreme damage is highly unlikely unless the holy RNG gods bless you, and it misses its swipe attack. Otherwise, you better hope you brought a flash grenade or are prepared to spend a first aid spray or herb. Other things are better thought out and expanded, like the boarded hallways no longer breaking and requiring shutter plugs. But the boards themselves are changed to consumable items you have to place and plan around. This is much more so a benefit of repeat playthroughs instead of initial ones, as you as a new player have no fucking way of knowing what hallways are even worth sealing up. And sealing the wrong ones can definitely put you in a bad spot. The gunpowder system has been brought back, and stuff like quick swapping weapons to the D-pad definitely helps the tedium of constantly pausing your inventory to get to everything. Also, the map has been improved, and because of that, I bullshit you not, this is the first Resident Evil game in my 2 decades of playing this franchise where I've ever bothered to use it. Locked doors and key item doors are marked when you encounter them. And when you enter a room, anything you've left behind or missed is also marked on your map, so you don't have to leave anything behind that you didn't want to. And the one thing that had me the most nervous about the remake was the save system. If you haven't watched any of my other videos on Resident Evil, I don't like ink ribbons. I never have, I never will. I've always felt that they were a garbage and unnecessarily tedious mechanic, and doing shit like that is what allowed games like Silent Hill to creep up and almost dethrone Resident Evil from the top. Thankfully, Capcom knows that most people are not dealing with that shit anymore. And so ink ribbons are there for the people that simply can't live without them in the form of hardcore mode. But the rest of the world doesn't have to subject itself to that horseshit because autosaves are a thing, as well as saving as much as you want on standard difficulty and below. The new additions like this have turned this game into a truly modern work of art. And even almost 6 years after its original release, it has stood the test of time in a way not even the remake of 1 can replicate. And huge shout out to whoever designed the animations for the flashlight because they did a hella good job. The police station mostly follows the same plot points with a few changes here and there. Marvin is alive for a lot longer, helping out. I should also mention that the first act at the station is just about the only spot where which character you picked first really even matters narratively. The first character will meet the second in the station not in the STARS office, but outside by a locked gate. And Marvin will already be dead when the second character gets here, even though that shouldn't happen until the other character comes back from the parking lot. But these are minor things. The only major thing I have a problem with is how the helicopter crash is handled. In the original, what caused this is explained pretty well, but in this remake it just randomly happens. No explanation whatsoever. Besides that, pretty happy with this act. Once we get the passage open, Marvin forces us to abandon him at gunpoint, just like in the original, and it's here where things start to get shaken up a little. Having to fight Birkin here as Leon really caught me off guard because it's not how things played out in the original. But with him being our first boss fight, it becomes immediately apparent that the old clunky boss fight problems of not having a dodge button show up in this game. This has always kind of been a problem for the earlier Resident Evil entries. It's not as bad simply because you're also not fighting the fucking camera angles like you used to have to, but I'd be lying if I said I don't get a little agitated over getting hit sometimes due to not having one. Especially when the next two remakes will have some form of dodge or parry. It's not so awful that you'll want to break your controller like it used to be in the old games, and you can manage without it, and I understand why it's not here for the same reason that there is a dodge mechanic in Resident Evil 3 Remake, but no defensive items, and that's balance. But I guess I just much prefer dodges to defensive items because it's a lot easier to take a hit that doesn't feel like it's your fault in 2 than it is in 3. This sort of thing was the same reason that the original 3 was my favorite over the original 2. But Birkin goes down, and in the parking lot, Leon meets Ada. This time around, she's a lot more dismissive of Leon than originally, as well as looking a lot more like a spy, and I like it. Ada has seen about 1 million other cops just like him dead. And knowing what we all know about Ada, a young rookie Leon is gonna have to prove himself worth her time before she bothers with him. Ben still gets mollywopped, but it's changed to as soon as Leon meets him by Trenchy and not by Birkin. And the goal becomes to get his keycard by looking for those old nostalgic spare parts to open his cell. A couple of other key items get swapped around, but the real big difference is the introduction of Mr. X. Trenchy here is no longer exclusive to just second scenario, and chases both characters this time around. If you know me by now, it's pretty clear I do not fucking like this pursuer enemy type. Never been all too scared of them, and they're just in the way of me getting to where I need to go. And I think Resident Evil 2 Remake specifically is the first real instance of it starting to get on people's nerves. At least in the Resident Evil franchise. Alien Isolation took so fucking long to get a sequel for a reason. A lot of people do like Trenchy and his antics. They've led to really cool clips of YouTubers and streamers and all that shit. But the decision to allow him into rooms like the bookshelf room got on a lot of people's nerves. I understand why he has to be able to come in here. But I'd be lying if I said I don't dread having to go ahead and release him into the sandbox because his gimmick gets old pretty damn quick. But since you can actually damage him, unlike Lady Demabitch, I guess he's alright. Since Ben is already dead this time, grabbing his badge leads to Leon getting caught with his ass out by Trenchy and being saved by Ada again. Things are back on schedule after that. Leon takes a bullet for Ada and we take control. Her section is a little annoying because she barely gets any ammo or supplies for some of the bullshit she has to deal with, and the oven thing is hella confusing. But resuming control of Leon, the sewers are expanded and a hell of an improvement. The weird G-adult thing from the original you fight to get in here has been reimagined as a fully fleshed out enemy type. And our second Birkin fight is a little different this time around too, but everything that goes on here checks out. Ada still cons Leon into getting the G-virus sample for her because she's injured. I'm really impressed by the Nest section's reimagining. I think of the 3 acts, it's definitely received the best glow up as far as monster designs, even if the plant chemical puzzle makes me want to punch my fucking TV every time I'm forced to do it. The Birkin fight here, because of clunky survival horror boss syndrome, ends up being a little annoying, but still far better than we ever got in the originals. The scene with Ada turning on Leon is devastating this time around, and you can tell he's really hurt by what happens here. And as you can tell in Resident Evil 4, he never really recovers from this emotionally. But that's most of the major changes for his campaign summarized. His final boss fight is solidified in canon as Super Trenchy, which honestly always made sense thematically with him and Ada over the course of this series, but required you to play Claire first, which most people are not gonna do. It's also not a frustrating piece of dog shit like the original fight was. The biggest gripe I have with it is this insta-kill attack he does. You would think you're supposed to get out of the way like the game has trained you to do the entire time. But no, this attack will track you no matter what. You are actually supposed to DPS him to knock him out of it. A dumbass, confusing decision. But once you know what you're supposed to do, you know what you're supposed to do. Claire's campaign, or whoever you choose for second scenario, picks up partway into the first when the helicopter crashes. From here, as always, she just goes through the same places Leon goes through, with different enemy placements. Shit gets real a lot earlier in second scenario, including Trenchy chasing you. I have one major issue with second scenario, and that is this really fucking stupid decision to replace the character's default weapon with the special bonus guns they could get from the original in their secret costumes. as well as replacing all the 9mm pistol ammo drops with the new 45 ACP that the guns take. They hold the guns like they originally did back then too. So, Claire rapid fires a revolver, and Leon holds his M1911 sideways. A cool nostalgia wank? Sure. But it's also just jarring to look at and distracting from the mood. This seems like the kind of thing that should be a bonus unlock for beating the game, and something that you toggle on and off before you start a playthrough. It means that you likely won't see much use out of their default pistol and its beautiful animation work. And I dislike it so much that I use a mod on PC to replace the 45 ammo with 9mm again. Now the special guns are stronger, so in theory reverting back to the default pistol should make the second run harder, but really it's not that big of a deal. With that out of the way, some of the biggest issues with the game crop up. Instead of fighting G in different phases depending on A and B scenarios, it will be the same boss fight in first and second every time. It's not something that I care about too much, as the original bosses weren't too different anyway in terms of how you deal with them, but it is worth mentioning. Claire also doesn't need to blow a hole into Chief Iron's room. He kidnaps Sherry as soon as she meets her, and takes her to a nearby school where he does his creepy murder stuff at. Speaking of the school, I could do without the Sherry section this time around. It's a typical trial and error, make sure you're not where the boogeyman is gonna look stealth section that's pretty ass, but it's brief. This is also where Birkin kills Irons this time around, as well as infecting Sherry and our way into the sewers. Also, Mr. X getting killed by Birkin here makes absolutely no fucking sense, considering he's canonically needed for Leon's campaign. But with old Resident Evil games, you just have to accept all these contradictions. This is just how they are, so it's whatever, I guess. Sewers and Nest are again mostly the same shit you did as Leon, only instead of looking for the G-Virus sample, Claire is looking for a vaccine for Sherry. Annette is still a bitch, and again, there's story contradictions all over the place as Leon and Claire do the exact same fucking thing in the exact same places, even in canon cutscenes. But hey, what can you do? You say the story from the classic games aren't really written that well and some 50-year-old gets mad at you. Claire's final boss is Birkin, and she gets a sick minigun to help this time around. Like her name is the fucking Doomslayer. Probably the best boss fight in the game. Everything from that point on is pretty much what you remember with your second scenario character fighting Birkin on the train at the end, and them all walking out into the sunset. As far as the bonus modes, I've tried them out and they're not for me. Fourth Survivor is still unbalanced trash, and not even being put in a modern game can save it. And while these bonus what-if mode scenarios are cute and everything, I'd much rather go play Mercenaries in a different Resident Evil game than ever really take these seriously. Resident Evil 2 Remake is incredible, and not only one of the best games in the entire series, completely eclipsing the original, even farther than the remake of the first game did to its counterpart, but also one of the most important video games ever made in the horror genre. You know, when I hear Avalanche reviews gloating over how good it is, and how right he was about classic survival horror,
quit whining and accept that traditional survival horror just can't work today because it's too clunky, obtuse, and inaccessible. To everyone who's told me the formula created by RE4 was the future for the series, I'd like to give a middle finger so fucking large it's visible from space. Not only can survival horror thrive in a modern context, but it's doing it right now in front of our very eyes. For the first time in a decade, I can say that Capcom is headed in more than the right direction.
I have no idea what he's doing this victory lap for, because nobody was ever really saying that survival horror couldn't work today. They said survival horror as it was in the 90s and the early 2000s couldn't work anymore. That things would need to change and certain things would have to go because people would not put up with that shit anymore. And this remake proves exactly that. I should be doing a fucking victory lap. This is not Resident Evil 2 remade to be a classic survival horror game. This is Resident Evil 2 remade to show what a modern survival horror game can be. This is not remade with the same goal as the remake of the first game, and that is the best thing about it. This remake's influence on modern survival horror can be felt half a decade later, whereas you have people even now who still will not touch Resident Evil 1 and say it needs another remake. And even though I like the remake of the first game, I can definitely see why. And you cannot really fault them for that. If you had one chance to get someone into Resident Evil, into survival horror in the real world, day to day, just on the street, you would have to be a complete fucking fool who is out of touch to recommend the remake of Resident Evil 1 over the remake of Resident Evil 2, knowing fully well that 22 years have passed since it came out. That is facts over feelings. But there is one more remake to talk about, and it gets a little messier here. Resident Evil 3 Remake is a complicated situation. It's good, really fucking good in fact, but it is missing some stuff it shouldn't be missing. Let's talk. So the game starts us with a nightmare sequence in Jill's apartment. The events of the first game have messed with her pretty bad, and like Chris, she's doing her own research into the conspiracies and cover-ups ever since Stars went out sad. And almost immediately the game lets you know what time it is, as Nemesis bursts through the wall with the dick out. And I always enjoy the opening to this game. The way she escapes only for Nemesis to burst through a wall and snatch her little ass right back up is diabolical. They put him over like Roman Reigns almost immediately. It creates a way better job of an opening than the original, while also paying respect to the original's weird abrupt opening that started with her flipping out of an exploding building. Meeting with Brad, she finds out Nemesis is hunting down STARS members, and during their escape he ends up being bit, having to sacrifice himself to save her. So already there are big changes from the original, but this one pays off later. From here, she picks up a gun and some gear off a dead officer, since Nemesis forced her to drop her samurai edge, and is chased through the city as Nemesis pretty much cuts off her escape attempt, and Carlo shows up to save the day and take her back to the train, where he and the rest of his squad are held out working to evacuate civilians. Since they are Umbrella employees, of course, she doesn't want anything to do with them, but will put up with them for the sake of saving the civvies. And that's the initial setup for the game. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the new Jill. A lot of people like the new Jill, a lot of people don't. Apparently, she's too much of a girl boss, or whatever the fuck buzzword chud bros use for characters like this, as if they're just not allowed to exist at all. There's clearly a change in Jill from the originals, but honestly I think it's for the better. I never really too much cared for old Jill, specifically in comparison to Chris. It's not like there was necessarily anything wrong with her personality before, it's just that compared to the rest of the Resident Evil women, she's just kind of plain. Claire has that sweet, fragile, emotional thing going for her that makes her great with kids, and gives her some interesting boyfriend dynamics, and she's got a pretty cool biker girl thing with a tough big brother who taught her how to handle herself. Ada is a sexy, playful spy that's one of the best at what she does, and is probably one of the most dangerous women in this series. And Jill was always just a good soldier. Like, personality-wise, there isn't much to write home about. It just boils down to, oh, she's nice. Well, most Resident Evil protagonists are. Sure, she looks cool, she's always had a nice design, but she was kinda like vanilla ice cream. If someone gives me some, sure I'll eat it, but I'd rather have New York cheesecake instead. I've heard criticism of her swearing a lot as if that's a bad thing, and to that I say stop being a little soy boy bitch or something, I don't know. I swear all the time, I'm sure my audience has picked up on it. I've never understood people who have a problem with characters who say the bad word. Always just struck me as them being weak. And no, it doesn't make you more clever than anybody else to pull out a thesaurus and use some bloated flavor word to get your point across when you could have just said the word fuck and been done with it. I feel like me and Remake Jill would get along great. Now, modern Jill does have some attitude problems, but for the most part she has a far more believable personality given her circumstances. Like Chris, she's pretty easily set off by bad guys and corruption, and here in this story it works in her favor. In the original, she's apprehensive about working with Umbrella for all of about 2 minutes before she changes her mind. Here, she's standoffish, rightfully and realistically so, and Carlos has to warm his way into her heart over time with his luscious, silky smooth curls. And it takes the train blowing up for her to realize that even employees of Umbrella are being played and aren't all in on this. Some of these guys are just trying to do the right thing. If any chick in this series has what it takes to be the angry, volatile badass, it's Jill. And I'm a huge fan of what they've done with her in comparison to how boring she used to be. They have taken it a bit too far at one point, and that was with the Death Island movie. She's pretty awful in that movie. She does shit like rush into rooms without backup, brush everybody off, and just act real bitchy. There's one scene in particular that is completely unforgivable, where Chris is trying to have a heart-to-heart with her, and he tells her about Piers and how much that event broke his heart and changed him. And she completely shuts him down like he's garbage on the street. If you want even the people who like a character to dislike him, that is 100% how to do it. That scene should have never happened that way. Like I said, I like the new Jill far better than the old one, but let's not get carried away. Dial it back a little. She's starting to turn into Kate from Gears of War 5, and holy fuck, is that a way to make a character completely irredeemable. They also undoubtedly pulled the excuse that she ages extremely slowly out of their ass to justify reusing her Resident Evil 3 model to market her, as logically that would be more profitable. A character like this, you want to write to be tough on the bad guys and people who she doesn't trust, but soft on her friends. That's how you build a layered character that isn't completely one-dimensional. Here, given the situation, like I said, she works, and I really like her dynamic with Nemesis here. She's sure of herself and willing to make some hard decisions, but is still very much afraid in a lot of situations involving him. It's not like she's never killed anything crazy before, it's just that Nemesis is unlike anything she's ever dealt with, and she gets increasingly scared and frustrated over his refusal to die. The city in the remake received some flack for not being bigger, and while I can understand where they're coming from, the reality is while the city in the original had more areas, Jill wasn't exactly doing jack shit when she explored it. The Spencer Mansion and the RCPD work the way they do because one is a secret test lab and the other is a museum or some shit under Umbrella's payroll. But it was always silly in 3 to have to do shit like put blue and green gems in a fucking door to pass through, to walk through a park so that you could get to the damn gas station, when there are like 15 different roads you could have taken to go around. I do not envy having to adapt Resident Evil 3, because the original story they were working with, in terms of getting Jill from place to place, was not very good back then, and is awful today if you just plop it into a modern game. She does fucking nothing for a third of it, meets Carlos and his merry little gang of bandits. They head to the clock tower where Evac gets screwed over by Nemesis, she gets infected, and then after Carlos saves her, she fumbles around doing absolutely fuck all for the rest of the game and then just happens to luck out and end up where she did. She wasn't planning to get here to the water treatment location. She just pranced around with a thumb up her ass and happened to walk past it and end up inside. And Carlos finds a way out of Raccoon City after Carlos learns that it's about to get nuked. The only useful thing Jill does is kill Nemesis. But the fact of the matter is, whether you want to admit it or not, the original game ended up being a game where Carlos did everything that mattered, besides that, and dog walked her to the helicopter. That is why in the remake they start her off meeting Carlos and his squad, so she's not fucking around for an hour and a half. And if you think I'm bullshitting you on how remaking these games under a modern lens requires rewriting and restructuring of the plot, go look at Resident Evil 2 Remake again. The reason why there are minimal changes, at least in the first half, is because the characters already have a reason for what they're doing. And when there isn't one in the original story, it's pretty easy to write one in. Leon fumbles his way through escaping the main station into the sewers in the original. Not exactly gonna work today, so instead he finds a notebook in the story that tells him about a way to get out. And then the reporter is rewritten from just being a mole for Ada to being a mole with the keycard he needs to escape the station into the sewers. With Resident Evil 3, changes like this to the original locations are pretty much impossible because they would be nonsensical. So it was always going to have to be completely rebuilt like this. Because in the original, Jill has pretty much zero reason to be anywhere she goes besides the fact that her feet took her there, with the exception of the clock tower. And trust me, the irony of being the only location with a goal in the original, while being cut in the remake, that rewrites everything with more goals and a better plot isn't lost on me. Gameplay-wise, the game is identical to Resident Evil 2, with the major change being the addition of Resident Evil 3's signature dodge mechanic, translated to the modern day. You dodge from attacks with the tap of a button. Nail it well enough and you do a perfect dodge where time slows down and you lock on the weak points for critical attacks. And unlike in the original game where it had trouble functioning right in terms of usefulness, this time around it works pretty damn well. What technically is missing is the defensive items of Remake 1 and 2. That has led to the misconception by people who don't know what the fuck they're talking about that the mechanics were downgraded. And I mean, sure, if you're retarded, I could see how you would come to that conclusion. But think a little deeper, and you may find that they took something away from you and gave you something else. The reason defensive items aren't here, and things like grenades and the knife are strictly offensive, is because of the existence of the dodge mechanic. You already have your defensive utility. If you could dodge and then also had the option to just use a defensive item when you were grabbed, you'd be completely fucking busted and overpowered. I'm sure they started with the defensive items as well and quickly realized that. Defensive items are also just way less of a risk versus reward as a mechanic than a dodge. The only way you risk anything with a defensive item is ending up getting grabbed from behind, where you can't use it. If you fuck up the dodge, you take extra damage as punishment, and so there's more of a skill requirement to use it. If you give the player the option to do both, they're going to lean towards the less risky of the two, and so that's why the items had to get axed. The dodging is part of RE3's identity. So if you have to axe one or the other, the correct decision is to axe the items and let the dodge do its thing. Listening to people call that a downgrade for almost 5 years in YouTube videos has made me roll my fucking eyes. The only issue I see here is that the knife lost its quick swap to the L1 button. That's something they should have kept. I should be able to do that as long as it's in my inventory. Outside of that, most of the gameplay mechanics are the same, with the addition of the environmental hazards from the original game. There are accusations of the gore being downgraded from Remake 2, but I was able to shoot off things like legs just fine, so I don't know where the fuck that came from. The bottom line is that the gameplay is still solid, but flavored with the stuff that makes RE3 what it is, instead of just copying and pasting the stuff from RE2's remake. Everything mostly follows what you would expect from there. Jill learns Nikolai is a piece of shit, like we remember him to be, and gets the train running after getting molested by this bug larva thing that has led to some of the craziest Rule 34 I've ever browsed. And she ends up splitting off from the group for a while to try to save the civilians and distract Nemesis, because they need about half an hour to finish working on the train. These were monsters that had a chance of appearing in the original, so if you don't remember them, I don't blame you. But they're back and way more dangerous. Nemesis snatching her up by the head the nanosecond she leaves the sewers will never get old. This leads to a hella good boss battle on top of a construction site with Nemesis. Outside of Resident Evil 4 Remake, these are probably some of the best boss fights this series has ever had. Whenever I think of Resident Evil 3 Remake specifically, this fight is one of the first images that pops in my mind. She beats him and runs into Kendo the earliest, but isn't shown his daughter's infection the way Leon and Ada are. And then here comes Nemesis again, back on that bullshit. Now let's talk about how Nemesis works in this game compared to his original counterpart. See, the typical comment section nerdsplainer always goes, golly gee, it's really weird how Mr. X was turned into the pursuer enemy, and Nemesis is more scripted this time around. And yeah, that's true, but there are several reasons for that. This Nemesis is more dangerous when he's chasing you than anything the OG could ever hope to match. The OG was faster than you, sure, but still had to catch you and could be bobbed and weaved. This motherfucker here does not give a single fuck what you are doing or where you are going. He will just jump in front of you with the dick out and smack you upside the fucking head. This Nemesis is a menace, and he hits like a fucking subway train. The OG was no slouch either, but the most threatening thing about him was his grab attack. Outside of that, he wasn't too bad one-on-one. This one here, I always save my grenades for him specifically to down him, because if you don't have any, holy fuck, bro, these streets ain't no Disneyland. He still drops weapon parts and items when you down him, but you gotta make sure you get everything you need here before you get on the train with Nikolai. Which I failed to do this time, so I just switched to the unlockable Samurai Edge. Which has its best ever showing in this game in terms of feeling like the elite pistol of a STARS officer. This thing is godly. Crit machine. Another part of the reason he works the way he does this time around is that, like I've said before, Mr. X was not to everyone's taste, and Capcom got a lot of flack in reviews from major outlets you'd expect like IGN and GameRanks, that he was kind of annoying to deal with. And like I mentioned earlier, yeah, there is some truth to that. Definitely find Remake Nemesis a lot more fun to deal with than Remake Mr. X. So, based on that feedback, they toned Nemesis down here in terms of being an actual pursuer. I mean, if the people are already complaining about Mr. X, what are they going to think of Nemesis, who's 3 times as dangerous when he's chasing you? They simply had to make a decision on who to listen to here, and whether or not they made the right call here is up to you, but I think in the end, the way they did Mr. X works better for how he is in the remake. But if they tried that with the upgraded and more dangerous Nemesis here, that was simply not going to work out as well. He's also been romanticized in nostalgia winking as being this unrelenting force that never let you breathe in the original, and that is just a complete lie. Maybe it's that old geezer back in my day brain rot. But Nemesis in the original was also extremely scripted. He shows up when the game tells him to, he follows you around for a couple of rooms or so, and then he's gone. Most of the time you can turn right back around when his music stops and he'll be gone completely. The clock tower works a little differently, but on average it was never really deeper than that. The dynamic actions thing was mostly a glorified do you want Nemesis to follow you right now, yes or no toggle. Outside of that, everyone except the very last one changed pretty much nothing in terms of how the story plays out. So, like I've said before, I can see why they got the axe, and I don't exactly miss them either. Like I've said countless times, multiple endings in a Resident Evil game is always a dumb idea. So, yes, he is more of a scripted set piece now, but with how much he's been buffed, it is absolutely in his best interest to be this way. Be that as it may, since everything is ready to go, Jill doubles back to the train station where Carlos and Tyrell get new orders to locate a doctor at the police station and split off from the group, leaving Jill stuck with Nikolai and the captain, who's hip to Nikolai's bullshit this time around. But as expected, Nemesis attacks the train, kills all the civilians, Nikolai betrays everyone, and the whole thing goes to shit. We switch to Carlos for a while as he and Tyrell explore RCPD. Brad ends up here, having already turned, and bites Marvin when he hesitates to shoot him, playing in nicely to Resident Evil 2. Carlos's loadout is pretty nice. Instead of a dodge, he gets a Superman counterpunch that is really fun to use. But Dr. Diddledick isn't even here, and Jill calls Carlos to let him know that Nikolai is a traitor and everyone but her is dead, so he heads out to go save her. And save her he needs to, because Nemesis is starting to mutate now. Another absolutely solid fight. But then, the game commits a sin that is almost unforgivable, and has Nemesis infect her right as soon as she reaches the clock tower, and she passes out, only for Carlos to find her and take her directly to the hospital. Yeah, needless to say, people who played the original game and then played this were not very happy about it. If you've never played the original, and honestly the game is so old I can't fucking blame you, this probably isn't something that even to this day you give a fuck about. But this simply should not have happened this way. There is no defense for this one, no design reason it's cut, it's just cut. This game was probably rushed to meet a deadline as it had to be out almost exactly 1 year before Resident Evil 8. And so there wasn't enough time to make the clock tower and still make the deadline. Knowing Capcom, the higher-ups probably were not going to push back the release date for Village, so Resident Evil 3 ended up having to get shafted. I do not believe for a second that the team that made this game was dumb enough to believe they could just cut the clock tower and it wouldn't disappoint anyone. I'm sure they probably started on it, and that's why Jill gets infected where she does, but this whole thing just turned out to be a mistake. Anyway, Carlos carries her back to the hospital and works on finding a cure and locating Dr. Diddledick, who turns out to be dead, as Nikolai's already got here first. He finds a video where the doctor admits to everything Umbrella was doing as well as finding the vaccine for Jill. And yes, we absolutely do need a holdout section in every Resident Evil game. If you don't fucking like it, stop fucking playing Resident Evil. Please and thanks. Within the time limit of Jill's infection and being passed out, keep in mind Resident Evil 2 is also happening. They learn that the city is about to be nuked, so Carlos goes to see if he can find another vial of the cure since he used the one he found on Jill, while Tyrell stalls the government for time. With Jill awake, she goes after Carlos into a second nest lab and Tyrell is killed by Nemesis. Jill does what she can to synthesize the cure herself so the government will call off the airstrike, while trying her best to stay away from Nemesis. But Nikolai fucks that up for her, steals the cure, and forces her to fight Nemesis. With a little help from Carlos, she melts it and goes after Nikolai. Nemesis still isn't dead and forces her into one final fight. And god damn do they make it an epic finish. This is definitely up there with my favorites. A fucking railgun to the mouth with a one-liner is diabolical work. And pure Resident Evil. But with that, she catches up to Carlos and Nikolai, and the bastard destroys the cure, pretty much dooming Raccoon City to its fate. And for that, they beat his ass and leave him there to die, while they escape on the chopper. Resident Evil 3 Remake is a phenomenal experience, but it's definitely more of a reimagining than it is a faithful remake. And that's because it pretty much has to be. They've always struggled to readapt the narrative because it was never originally a good story in the first place. The story changes are another thing that divides people, but I think that's really just nostalgia wanking. Resident Evil 3 is my favorite of the classics, but that is mostly for gameplay reasons. The original story told is kinda dog shit in terms of any sort of agency. And I've said it before, but Jill by the end of it seems completely incompetent outside of her big moment where she kills Nemesis. In Resident Evil 1, Barry dog-walked her through everything, and that didn't do much for her in terms of cool factor and accomplishments compared to Chris. So Resident Evil 3 is supposed to be her big break, her solo starring act. And for a third of it, until she gets to the train, she fumbles around the city doing pretty much fucking nothing. Someone hands her their own plan for escaping. Until then, you're just doing a bunch of weird shit that doesn't make any sense. Traveling to the RCPD to get a fucking lockpick for a door she could just loop around in a city? Or she could just shoot the lock off of it. Yeah, I know you have to kind of just suspend your disbelief in Resident Evil games a lot of times to make the progression work, but there's a limit to that. And Resident Evil 3 originally definitely pushed those limits. She just ends up where she ends up until the game decides it's time to end. And canonically, in the old timeline, Barry just magically finds her before the city blows. I'm sorry if I'm bursting your nostalgia cherry, but I'm telling you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. That's why the remake of 3 is reimagined the way it is, because it has to give reasons for shit. Why is Jill frolicking around this city? Because she's found a way out and can save civilian lives if she bites the bullet and works with Umbrella, despite not really wanting her to. Why revisit the RCPD? Well, instead of being something silly like a fucking lockpick, it's to track down an important Umbrella scientist. Instead of fucking around in a water plant at the end, they write something way better by having Jill and Carlos try desperately to get the government to stop the nuke by building a vaccine to save as many people still trapped in the city as possible, instead of heading right for the helicopter. Don't try to feed me some bullshit about this new Jill being a bad person or something, because yeah, she's got an attitude, but seeing Nikolai destroy this cure breaks her fucking heart. What made Resident Evil 3 great despite its narrative problems is Nemesis, and the improvements to the gameplay and fun factor. And in those ways, the game still lives up to its predecessor. The enhanced ammo mechanic didn't make the cut, sure, but it wasn't too well put together in the original anyway, even if those enhanced shotgun shells from the original speak to my soul. But, in exchange, you just get better bonus weapons. The Samurai Edge is more deadly than the enhanced handgun, and stuff like the Hot Dogger and other fun bonuses like the crafting tool and the perfect dodge buff manuals more than make up for that, honestly. And the appeal of Resident Evil 3 is still intact to me. This is still the first game in the series where you don't have to share weapons with a secondary character, and almost everything in the game Jill can have for herself. It's all hers, use it however you see fit. No secondary scenarios you need to mess around with that complicate shit way more than it ever needed to be. It's a solid focused game with a solid focused story, and is reimagined faithfully enough to where most of the important shit that needed to happen all still happens. Like I said, it's not all sunshine, it fumbles the clock tower, and beyond that, things like the missing retro costumes that Resident Evil 2 gave us for fun, or the fact that the classic costume is now a fucking skirt instead of a skirt, is also a knock against it. Like seriously, whoever did this needs to be fucking kicked in his balls. The original outfit always looked fucking ridiculous, like she was working street corners on Saturdays, giving a good glaze down, on discount for just $10. But if you do like classic costumes, then yeah, you kinda get shafted here. Also, I don't care for ink ribbons at all, and I'm glad they're gone, but being that the remake of 2 had them on hardcore, as much as it may be to my taste in celebration that this game's hardcore mode throws them in the fucking trash permanently, I have to acknowledge that fans of ink ribbons, for whatever reason for existing, also get shafted here. But overall, I'd say it still turned out great. I don't think it ended up being as complete of a package as the Resident Evil 2 remake turned out, but it still turned out pretty fucking good. And I've said this before in previous videos, but I have to reiterate it. But a game not being as good as something else you compare it to, like Resident Evil 2 Remake, but still being good, still means it's fucking good. I mean, seriously, I've seen some people call the game mediocre or awful. And honestly, could you even be more of a melodramatic bitch? Oh wait, I guess you can. It also gets weird criticism that doesn't make sense. Like being called out for the Unlock Everything DLC you can buy, which not only was in the remake of 2, but also has been a thing in most Capcom games since Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition, and has never really been a big deal. You want to do all the requirements to unlock this and that, that's your business. But if Capcom offers me $5 to never have to deal with ink ribbons again and still get my infinite ammo machine gun, and then I spend my fucking money I worked for, that's none of your goddamn business. And you don't even lose anything, so what's the issue? And the bottom line is that the game was still a massive success. 8 million copies sold as of today. Is that as much as the Resident Evil 2 remake? No. But the original Resident Evil 3 didn't sell as much as the original Resident Evil 2 anyway. So that's no surprise there. That's simply the power of Leon Kennedy. And if you don't believe that, there's a reason why Capcom puts Leon in every single movie and animated series. So despite its flaws, it sure wasn't enough to turn off people away from it. It also, like 2, has the advantage of being redesigned for modern gaming expectations. I remember after Resident Evil 8 came out, and it was pretty clear that the Resident Evil remake was over and done with as far as development, there were still these guys demanding some corny Nemesis edition that was going to add in the clock tower, add in more Nemesis, and, fix their personal gripes with it, and I was just looking at this shit like, why would they do that? The fact of the matter is they received more praise than they did any sort of backlash. And statistically speaking, you have 2 gaming generations worth of people who just aren't gonna give a fuck that the clock tower was cut, versus the one that was around when this game came out that does. Whether you want to hear it or not, no matter what you say, there are going to be millions on millions who are familiar with later Resident Evil games, go to try one of the original Resident Evils and just don't fucking like it. The reasons why should be obvious. I know a chick right now who wanted to get into Resident Evil because she thought Leon was hot or whatever. Tried the original Resident Evil 3 because Jill being a girl in Nemesis intrigued her, but couldn't fucking stand it. Tried the remake and loved it and never looked back. And has pretty much fallen in love with the entire modern remake trilogy since then. Even the original Resident Evil 3 had its fair share of detractors calling it weaker than the original, an asset flip, that it was too short, that it didn't innovate as much, that it was still clunky, blobbity fucking blah blah blah. Be that the original or the remake, Resident Evil 3 has never really had an easy ride. But that's fine. It did what it needed to do mostly, and that was fix up the story and the game for modern audience and expectations. If it wasn't for cutting the clock tower, I would say there weren't even any major missteps with it. And even with cutting the clock tower, like I said earlier in the script, if I wanted to get someone into Resident Evil today, I would always recommend the entries in the modern remake trilogy above anything else for the best chance of winning them over. And that is something that these remakes have excelled at. Convincing people who take a look at the Resident Evil games they have to start with, who are 1 to 2 generations too late to tolerate that you have to play them, and giving them a more palatable alternative. In the real world, not in your YouTube echo chamber with convoluted made-up stories about how someone started with Resident Evil 2 Remake or 3 Remake, didn't like either, stopped playing halfway through, and then played the originals on an emulator and loved them to death to get a Notice Me Senpai like from you if you read their comment, so they can get some feel-good points. But in the real world, that requires you to go outside and interact with people. So I know that's a little scary for you. People don't actually give a fuck about this kind of thing. They're going to play the remake of a game and be done with it. And honestly, they don't have a single fucking reason not to. Just because you disapprove. Because they don't owe you a bitch-ass thing. Sorry, that's just how it is. But that wraps up my thoughts on both these remakes overall. They're both pretty solid. Resident Evil 2 has issues with contradicting itself in its own plot, even while trying to fix the jumbled plot of the original. And Resident Evil 3 has fixed a lot of issues with its original plot, yet cutting out a beloved area of the game was not a good look. But of course, what matters most is the gameplay, and each offers their own flavor of the formula, And you're never gonna come home from a long day at work or school, pop in one of these remakes to chill, and have it be a mistake. They're always solid and infinitely replayable, and I never have a bad time revisiting them. I don't play them as much as I replay Resident Evil 4 Remake or Dead Space Remake or something, but that's because I'm an action horror man over a survival horror man. You know how it is with me, shooty bang bang pleases me. Speaking of which, the reason that Resident Evil 4 Remake isn't in this video is because since it dropped mere months apart from Dead Space Remake, I combined the two into one video. Because of the way I did it, I can't really plop it in here when I plop in the combined video of my Resident Evil reviews, so I'll link it in the description instead. I love this franchise to death. It's beloved, it's divisive, everyone has their favorite game. I think it's pretty clear that some games may be hated by some people and loved by others and vice versa. It's just the kind of franchise with something for everybody. And I hope you guys have enjoyed me talking about it over the course of this past year or so. I had a lot of fun doing this shit. Even writing this script, I can't believe I finally finished it. But, with it done, allow me to go on a rant one final time. And for those of you who love it when I do this sort of thing, you might want to grab a drink and a snack. This one's going to be a doozy. The movement that these remakes have started is very important, and Resident Evil 2 Remake in particular is responsible for influencing modern survival horror games like Alan Wake 2 and the banger remakes we've been getting in Dead Space, Silent Hill 2, and even other franchises. Hell, even Alone in the Dark is in on its action, and that series has rebooted itself a million fucking times. This has led to massive success, introducing millions and millions who were interested in some of these older horror games, but grow up in a generation too far evolved to put up with some of their older bullshit, becoming beloved fans who love these franchises to death, and giving them a respectful version of a game that they will love that will last far longer, as it has all the presentation and gameplay systems you'd expect from a modern game or a more modern entry in its own series. And if I've learned anything over these last few years, it's that it doesn't matter how good your remake is, how much you pay respect and understanding to the source material, or even if the guys who made it in the first place come out and say they are pleasantly surprised and proud of how you've handled their work, and improved or fleshed out certain things that they didn't, there will always be some bitch crawling out of a crack in the wall like a fucking roach to drop some video of dog shit nitpicks because he thinks he's some pseudo-intellectual, or some old fuckhead running away from the fact that he's getting old like his hairline ran away, that has to open his fucking mouth. It never fails. You cannot please these people no matter what. Their head will always be lodged up their own ass, and their complaints will never make a lick of sense. Resident Evil 3 Remake is actually about the same length of the original, give or take 30 minutes to an hour if you don't let the dynamic actions con you into thinking you need to start a whole new fucking playthrough. But it's too short, right? For a full-priced game, we should expect better now. We should expect longer and blah 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 bitty fucking blah. But now, the Silent Hill remake comes out, things are expanded, things are more fleshed out, but now it's too long. It's too bloated. They've meddled with the pacing of the original and blah 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 bitty fuck. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see what the fuck I mean? Do you see why I started to do this thing now? Do you see why I don't fucking like any of these people? And under the Mayo's case, you always expect something stupid to be said, so no surprise there. And I know I've recommended Boulder Punch in the past, I take that shit back. It has become increasingly clear this man cannot review a single fucking remake to save his life. And he is so scared of the fact that he's aging, and he isn't gaming's target audience anymore, that he will split hairs and grasp at anything he can to avoid admitting a remake could possibly be better than an original work. As if he disses remakes enough, he can avoid that Grim Reaper creeping his way closer and closer as he looks in the mirror and stares at his gray hairs in fear. See, the angle of this scene has changed, and therefore it invokes a different feeling. That by default means it pales in comparison to the originals. The lighting here has changed. It doesn't give the same mood as blah 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 bitty fuck, you know, that kind of shit. These days, you can watch a video whining about a fucking remake and just predict the points that will be raised, even if you've never played the original or the remake. I'm serious. Go type in the word remake on YouTube right now. Pick a random game you've never played before. Find a video critical of the remake of said game. And take a shot of vodka for every time somebody complains about a lighting change, a camera angle change, a soundtrack change, oh, this enemy placement is different here, you know, like anything they can say. Motherfuckers are just so afraid to just say a remake is good and possibly better than the original. I have no idea why. You wouldn't believe it unless you've seen it, because the game is so old. A lot of these motherfuckers are either extra dead or somewhere in a hospital in a vegetable state. But there are people, even now, who shit on the remake of Resident Evil 1, believing it isn't as good as the original. Crazy! They say stuff like, oh, Lisa Trevor was an unneeded blow. Can you believe that? Like I said, you cannot please everyone, and you definitely cannot please these motherfuckers. They're gonna lube up, load up their favorite emulator, and let the fuck machine pound them on full blast like a cam girl, while writing off your remake no matter what you do. The people that worked on these older games have said time and time again that they are embarrassed by their old work and the limitations they had to work with back in these days. And that seeing their old visions reimagined with all these modernized camera angles and lighting and all the upgrades that come with being a modern game makes them pretty fucking happy. And fuck a Boulder Punch, fuck a Nam's Compendium, fucking Under the Mayo, if the guys who made the damn thing in the first place give it their blessings, that's the end of the fucking discussion. That's the final vote. You can literally bring back the guy who made the original soundtrack to do it again, any way he wants, and one of these dickheads on this platform will open up their fucking mouth about how the soundtrack has been downgraded and invokes a wrong feeling compared to the original. Like you know better than the motherfucker who made the original soundtrack because you watched some old documentary on the making of an old game before the people in it had any sense of modern technology or where the gaming landscape would shift. And that somehow makes you the overseeing authority on what's true to the original and what isn't. Get the fuck out of here, dude. For all the whining and complaining that we all do about the state of modern gaming, these remakes have been critical to the resurgence of good quality single player experiences. As publishers and developers look to the past, realizing what worked before can work again if you update it to modern standards and put love and time into it. And that goes on to influence new works. Something like Alan Wake 2 would never have happened the way it did or turned out as good without the Resident Evil 2 remake. And honestly, a lot of this shit being remade is so old that motherfuckers who were born in the year it came out have children and families now. Really think about that. All this whining about how developers can't come up with any new ideas and just do remakes and blah 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 is fucking funny to me, because anytime anybody does try anything new or take any risks, these fucking YouTube leeches just shit on it. Put them down and then dance on their graves for some ad revenue. So it's not like they want anything new any fucking way. Oh yeah, sure. Let's just drop a new System Shock, a new Serious Sam, a new Dead Space, a new Silent Hill, into a new generation and audience that has little to vague experience with any of these franchises themselves, because Johnny Limp Dick, who's pushing 30 to 50 and should be a little more focused on his erectile dysfunction, played them in their original eras and feels that they don't need a remake, like the gaming landscape still revolves around him. Fuck him, I'm over here chilling out playing this remake of Nier. Not everyone is interested in digging out an emulator to play something like Persona 3 and force themselves to deal with some original jank and frustration after coming off a series titan like Persona 5, just because some old bitch is upset and doesn't want it touched, when that same person could have a remake that updates it to the standards of its modern entry expectations instead, and end up loving it far more than they ever would have playing the original. And no, Timmy Tinycock, who likes retro games and romanticizes and handwaves any flaw of older game design as adding to the charm and identity, isn't saying anything worth a damn either. I grew up with the PS2 era, and there's certain shit games from this time did that even I wouldn't put up with today. And it's always funny to me how whenever these motherfuckers want to knock against a remake, no matter how good, it's no, it's not a masterpiece. See, it has flaws, it isn't always perfect. It's good, but it could be better. But whenever they want to defend some old work against any modern criticisms, it's, oh, these flaws, these blemishes, these bugs, they all add to the charm. You have to take yourself back in time to the point when it came out. You know, saying shit like this to a motherfucker who wasn't even born when the fucking game came out. Then, and only then, is it okay to not be 100% perfect. And I know math wasn't my best subject in school, but these numbers ain't fucking adding up, Mason. Speaking of which, The worst offender is our favorite short bus bandit, Susie the Sphere Hunter, who isn't even gonna bother to review the new Silent Hill 2 remake because she's tired of remakes or some shit, which is a blatant fucking lie because as you can see here, in 4K, she's having the time of her life with a remake of Dead Rising, about 10 days just before the Silent Hill 2 remake came out. So clearly, you're not so tired of remakes that you can't promote them or give your recommendations on them. You are not beating the allegations of being a personal fucktoy for Capcom like this. But hey, anything to be able to voice Triss in a shitty mobile game, huh? Even if it means being Capcom's concubine. I play fighting games. I play Street Fighter. I haven't seen Sphere Hunter in ranked even once. Has anyone else? I know she's gone to EVO a few times, but that doesn't mean much when arching your back for Capcom gets you free trips out there anyway. But you can review a game in a genre you don't really fuck with, yet can't review possibly one of the most important games in determining whether or not Silent Hill makes a comeback. A series that you profited off of, that puts you on the fucking map and allows you to do what you do. That you claim is oh so important to you. Really? Okay. I hope Capcom board at least used condoms when they were taking turns. I tell you what, if Susie ever, for any reason, covers another fucking remake after this dog shit tweet, I will fucking destroy her in a video. You kids want to see someone get iDubbbz content copped in the 2020s? Let Susie fuck around and find out, and not stand on business when it comes to this tweet, and I'm on her ass like Sergeant Dokes in Dexter. Listen, I'm no stranger to hot takes. As a matter of fact, I have a lot of them. Want another one that applies to some of my next projects? Silent Hill 2 Remake was so good, it made me stop my next project, which was Mass Effect and Doom, to push the Silent Hill series ahead in my pipeline in terms of games to cover. And while I've enjoyed 1, 2, and 3, I haven't really been feeling 4 all that much. And I tried Homecoming instead, which is apparently one of the westernized ones that ends up being one of the more divisive entries, and I've been loving it so far. But the takes I see out of these motherfuckers is clear rage bait. It's clear nostalgia wanking, and I'm just not for it. I wish YouTube had a fucking mute channel button so I didn't even have to look at this nonsense. But alas, I walk these gallows with no hope for salvation. Alright, that's the rant over. In other news, you did hear that right. Silent Hill is on the horizon next, as well as Doom. Playing the original Silent Hill 2 and then the remake back to back was such a good experience that, like I said, I went ahead and played the first 3 games in general. So you guys better thank Blooper Team for letting it skip ahead in line by dropping this masterpiece of a fucking remake. I'm gonna try this thing where I break videos down game by game instead of in a bundle, as I'm finding that it simply takes too long to get videos out like you guys want. I do this for fun with a full-time job, not because I have any plans of mainstream success or making YouTube my job. And that allows me to be as raw as I am, but it also means I take more time to finish one of these. I don't have an editor where I can just, record a script, record some gameplay, and then kick back and let somebody else do all my work for me. I have to do it myself. But I'll catch you guys next time.